and sit whilst I lecture you. I shall try and not be as boring. Oh dear, you want to use that thing? And not be quite as boring as the typical German academic who regards tedium as a sign of professorial authority. But what I want to talk about this, I own a book. Right. What I want to talk about this evening is why we bother with history. The conventional answer is that we, the modern academic historians, that we simply study history for itself. In other words, that we look at the past as an interesting intellectual exercise. Perhaps it helps us to ground ourselves culturally, though generally speaking, that has been rejected by fashionable historians. What I want to do this evening is to suggest that the old view of history, that it is the essential ground of all human experience, needs to be reasserted. We need to remember that there is only one proper way of understanding human behavior. That is not in accordance with theory. It's not in accordance with abstraction. It's in accordance with what human beings have done before. That seems to me to be the proper starting point. It's also exactly the starting point of the whole of what we take our foundations from, the ancient world. If you look at the great historians of the ancient world, they are the great Greeks and Herodotus and whatever, what they're all effectively doing is writing history for now. They are trying sometimes to be as accurate as possible. Sometimes they are acutely party-free, and they do what we all do. They falsify then for the purposes of now. But they are firmly writing history for now. I think we should probably, in fact, I'm certain, we should compromise. We should have that, I was teasing about Germany, we should have that world that I was brought up in. I am a product of the extraordinary German influence on English academic life after the Second World War. I went to Cambridge in 1964, and I encountered there this astonishing world that was effectively created by German Jewish exiles, those who've been driven out of Germany by the horrors of Nazism. And there's a very, very nice little story which will give you an illustration of just how profound their influence was. English, and I'm now talking about English, I don't know about Scotland. I'm fully aware England and Scotland are wildly separate cultures, and I don't want to trespass too much into that territory, except to tease occasionally, because remember, the first football international was between England and Scotland, and we've been replaying Flodden ever since, with usually the same result. If you remember that unfortunate battle in which James IV of Scotland, because he was so fashionable, equipped his troops with pikes, which are 20 feet long, and sent them to charge down a hill at the English archers, who sort of relaxed, wetted their lips and popped them off one by one, including most of the Scottish aristocracy. Anyway, that's a byline. We need to go back to that world that I encountered. The story is 1953, and the actual English representatives at the World Congress of Historical Sciences in, of course, the Soviet-occupied Budapest. And the English delegation consisted of Geoffrey Elton, original name Gottfried Rudolf Ehrenberg. It consisted of Joel Hirschfeld, proper name Joel Buschfeld, and it also consisted of Walter Ullmann, who at least had the courage to retain his own name. And by the way, that last remark is deeply, deeply wrong. Elton changed his name because he fought for Britain. And terrifyingly, any of you are familiar with Geoffrey Elton's work, he finished up as Sergeant Interrogator. Can you imagine what it was like being on the other side of the desk? Elton writes about Cromwell so brilliantly because I think he'd done what Cromwell had done. There's a famous photograph of Geoffrey sitting exactly as I'm sitting now, with behind him, looking in his 20s, as I knew him in his 40s, very thick-set, moustache, completely bald, sitting like this at the desk, and behind him, some great thug of a military policeman with his arms like this, and a stick. And you knew what would happen to the person sitting in front of that table when Geoffrey raised the typewriter. That's why he can write about Cromwell as he does. He's done the same thing. But that shows you the astonishing domination of the English historical world by these people. And what they derived from was that world of 19th century Germany and Ranke, and the belief in the absolute primacy of the historical record and the proper and precise reconstruction of the past through the most detailed examination of evidence. And that has been what I based the entirety of my academic career on, including destroying Elton's own work by actually looking properly at the evidence which he'd studied badly. One person here very much wanted me to talk about the Tudors, and that wasn't really the great point of what I was wanting to make this evening, but it will be a very, very good illustration. I can establish precisely the date on which Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn agreed to marry. And I can do it on the basis of one word in one letter. Henry VIII's love letters survive in, of all places, the Vatican. I've always said that it probably offered a little stimulus to the late John Paul II, who was that strange feature, an actually heterosexual pope. But there we are. The collection of they are mildly naughty. There's a lot of stuff on Anne Boleyn's pretty duckies and all the rest of it. They finish up in Rome because they were, of course, the key evidence that shows that Henry VIII was acting in complete bad faith throughout the whole divorce. All this stuff about wanting to validate his marriage to Catherine was absolute nonsense, because you can actually date the fact that Anne and Henry promised to marry 6 weeks before the divorce case starts. So Henry VIII is exactly like most modern men when they claim to have conscientious scruples. He is the equivalent of a drunk at the bar. And if you've noticed, the drunk at the bar buys a new drink before he's quite finished the old one. And Henry's attitude to relationships is exactly that. Anyway, how can I know so precisely? The letters are in French. Anne is primarily French in culture. She spends most of her life in France. And there is one extraordinary letter in which Henry thanks Anne for a gift, a symbolic gift of a maiden tossed in a ship seeking refuge. And he says, as a result of this, I know you surrendered to my protective arms. Before us lies marriage. And he actually swears a grand royal oath, aut illic aut nullibi, either there or nowhere. But there's no date. And this is absolutely typical of ordinary letters in the early 16th century are hardly ever dated. They may say Sunday or Monday. But obviously important royal letters in the sense of instructions or whatever are often dated 3 or 4 different ways, by regular years, by years of grace, by papal indictions, by all sorts of things. So how can I do it? Because Henry uses one word. He doesn't talk about that as a don, the usual French for cadeau. He uses one extraordinary word. He calls it une étrenne. Une étrenne, anybody here good at Latin? Strena, New Year's Day gift. It's given on the 1st of January. Because remember, they don't give gifts then on Christmas Day, they give them on New Year's Day. And the astrological New Year, the Roman New Year, the Januarius, the keep of the gates between year past and year to come on the 1st of January. And there's only one January can be, and it's 1527. So you actually know the date. That's the sort of history I've always done. The history of absolute specificity and the pinning of human these extraordinary complex actions down on the map of time, the construction of the narrative. Because again, it seems to me the great mistake that most modern academic historians make is to forget that the narrative isn't known. They assume that the conventional narrative is known. When you test it, it usually isn't. So I'm a passionate believer that you can actually know that knowledge is real, that not everything is debatable. In fact, most things aren't, in the sense of what happened. How you understand it, a different matter. But having established, as far as one can, and as honestly as one can, that historical narrative, that Rankian approach to history, which was what I was brought up in Cambridge, I've been more and more convinced, which is the point that I'm wanting to make to you now, what do we do with it? I suppose it's also when you get older and you've got a little bit tired of the effort of working out unit time and spending endless hours in record offices with bent pencils and this kind of thing, and you get to the terrible stage of your life where you have great thoughts. And I'm old enough now to have many great thoughts. The conclusion that I've come to, and here again I want to acknowledge an influence. I want to acknowledge the influence of Neil Ferguson, not the bad Neil Ferguson, the idiot who got us into lockdown with his false statistics at Imperial College, but the good Niall Ferguson, a good product of Glasgow, and my friend and colleague for many years at both Cambridge and Oxford, and now back in England. And he was one of the great pioneers of the use of historical analogy, the attempt to understand the present through the past. There's a wonderful, he writes a column for Bloomberg, which is exceedingly well paid. And his most recent example, for example, is to look at, that was a very bad sentence, sorry, the most recent instance, for example, was his analysis of Netanyahu as the new Bismarck. And it's an astonishingly effective way of looking at what he's doing and how brilliantly he's double-crossing his enemies and using force as an absolute deliberate choice in both international and domestic politics, and achieving so far exactly the sort of success that Bismarck has done. The interesting moment is going to be, is there a dropping of the pilot? You remember Bismarck's career ends when he's dismissed by Kaiser Wilhelm II, and there's a famous Punch cartoon that shows the Kaiser dropping the very characteristic Bismarck with his great spiked helmet and heavy drooping moustache and all the rest of it. And I think the answer is Netanyahu hasn't. And I would also say that the probable conclusion to the triumph of Netanyahu's career can be summoned in a single phrase. We've heard endlessly, give peace a chance. I think, and clearly Netanyahu thinks, we should give war a chance. Let that sink in. Right, what do I want to do? I want to test this idea with you in 3 or 4 different ways, as to ways we think about our current situation using the analogy of history. Forgive me. Water. And let's see if we can do them roughly in some sort of order. What I'll do, I'll begin with Brexit. I'll then look at the complex nature of British, English, Scots, Welsh, Irish identity, throw out the odd idea about empire, and then I'll finish on the thing that I'm most interested in at the moment, which is the fact that we are back in the 1970s, that we are rerunning the history of 50 years ago, and that the best way of understanding what is going to happen now is the almost literal comparison with the 1970s in Britain. Well, let's begin with Brexit. I received an awful lot of flack during the Brexit debate when I pointed out that Henry VIII was our first Brexiteer. And it seems to me the comparison is direct and real. The medieval Catholic Church was exactly like the EU. And indeed, anybody who is familiar with the background of the EU will know that it arises from Christian democracy. That's exactly what it comes from. It is essentially Catholic in inspiration, and it draws on Catholic doctrines of an agreed common good. It is also profoundly anti-democratic and profoundly anti-British. It's conceived of from the very beginning with the Coal and Steel Federation, was put together deliberately to exclude Britain, to Attlee's furious resentment. Okay, but let's now just look at why the comparison with Henry is useful. Because the medieval Catholic Church was very, very similar to the structure that the EU has created. It is obviously, deliberately pan-national. It has its own specific language, Latin. It has its own specific legal system, canon law. It claims a supranational authority by definition, and indeed, with the papacy of the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, it actually claims, which is what we see the EU trying to do with Orban, for example, it claims not simply a supranational authority, it claims a supranational authority. In other words, the right of the popes from Gregory XIII onwards, the right that they claimed to dethrone monarchs. So there's a remarkable series of parallels there. And finally, of course, it also imposed something very similar to what the EU does, a system of universal European taxation. Hotly fought over by the English state. The English state, right back into the High Middle Ages, was profoundly resentful of the papal claim, for example, to provide the benefices and all the rest of it. And long before Henry VIII, in the 13th century, we passed the great acts of provisors and praemunire, the acts that forbid the Pope to actually provide, to appoint people to English benefices, and the terrible penalties of praemunire, which introduced penalties, this is very interesting, introduced penalties of confiscation of all property and life imprisonment for anybody who imported papal legislation without royal permission. That's 200 years before Henry VIII. So, but what Henry VIII does, of course, is to confront directly rather than indirectly that papal challenge. And it seems to me that what Henry does is really essentially to prepare the way for the extraordinary, complex and tense relationship between England and Europe of the last 400 or 500 years. Remember, before Henry VIII, between the Norman conquest and Henry VIII, the fact that we are an island opens us to invasion rather than protects us from it. If you actually look at the history, this nonsense of Britain, the last time we were conquered is 1066. It's a total absurdity. Every change of regime in the Middle Ages is a result of a foreign conquest. If you have a country with some of the most astonishing natural harbours in the world and no system of proper coastal defence, then of course anybody can land anywhere. And that, as we are discovering, dare I say, for another subject of illegal channel crossings, which we'll leave off for the moment. But up between the Norman conquest and the reign of Henry VIII, the entire angle of England is south. The Channel is not a line of divide, it's a line of connection. Before the Norman conquest, we look across the North Sea. We're essentially part of Scandinavia. We're Greater Scandinavia, and the culture is a Greater Scandinavian culture. And then there's this decisive shift with the Norman conquest that means we become an Anglo-French culture. That you go across, that you look south. Remember, for most of the Middle Ages, England is part of a great cross-channel empire of one form or another. The language itself is a complete and deliberate fusion of what's left of Anglo-Saxon, which by this point is largely grunts. It's very important that we understand this. Its entire sophisticated grammar, case endings of the lot has gone by this point. And it's very interesting if you actually look at the war cries of Hastings. The French has already settled largely into its modern form. So the war cry of the Norman knights at Hastings is Dieu aide, God help us. Indeed, it was God help the English. The war cry of the English housecarls of King Harold, listen to it, oot, 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 out, out, out. It's like Arthur Sparkle's miners, you know. And anyway, you fuse these two languages astonishingly in the world of Chaucer. English is a language which only dates to the end of the 14th century. It is an astonishing modern creation, right? So England then, before that point, the Channel is not a barrier, it's a means of communication. Who turns the Channel into a barrier? Who creates the self-consciousness of England as a separate identity? Who creates the idea of England itself as distinct, with a distinct linguistic experience that can stand up to every other country? In other words, who creates the Brexiteer mindset? It's Henry VIII and the Reformation. The great passages of Shakespeare, this sceptred isle, this jewel set in the silvered sea, and all that stuff, the great John of Gaunt speeches, are taken directly from the works of Thomas Beacon, who's one of Henry VIII's principal propagandists in the 1540s. And it's not simply the idea of language, as it were, in the abstract. The thing that anchors this entire approach to claiming that English is a great language, believe it or not, the first complete edition of the poet Chaucer is actually an official publication sponsored by the King and the King's printer, Thomas Bartlett, and with an introduction written to it by the equivalent of Gordon Brown, by the Treasurer of the Chamber, a man called Brian Tuke, wonderfully written, we know, from his inscription in his copy, which survives in Queen's College, Cambridge, written whilst I was waiting for the turning of the tide at Greenwich. In other words, so that he could be rowed back between Westminster and the King's regular residence at that point, before you finish rebuilding Whitehall, which is Greenwich Palace. And what he says in that preface is, English is a new great language, able to stand comparison not only with Latin and Greek, but with the great modern languages, French, German, Spanish, Italian, and so on. It's a great language because it's acquiring a regular grammar, it's acquiring a regular vocabulary, and it has a poet of national stature who is Chaucer, who compares with Homer or Virgil. So you're making that kind of claim, and at the same time, you're literally making England defensible. The idea in those great speeches, in a sense, the whole Brexiteer argument, the fact that England is this protected island, is made literal by Henry VIII, because he spends about a third of the wealth of the monasteries on fortifying the entire English coastline in the most ambitious scheme of fortification before Napoleon and the Second World War. And both the anti-Napoleonic forts and the Second World War defences are usually cited where Henry VIII put this stuff. He invents places like Newcastle, Hull, whatever. They're all invented to this point under the great fortresses. So you actually, and we have the maps. Henry VIII is fascinated by map making. They all survive in the Cottonian collection, and you can see that he's got sketch maps and perspective views, and he's actually citing the forts himself. So he literally makes this a defensible island in that sense of us over there, the wickedness of Europe. I remember my mother, my first school trip was to Rome, and I'm aged 13. My mother is a northern working class Puritan. She was both proud that I was going, secretly horrified, because they were foreign and they were Catholic, they were probably dirty. She didn't want to say any of these things to me. So I still remember the injunction, David, wash your hands a lot. They have very funny toilet habits. Indeed, it turned out that they did. And that's the world. That is that world of the separation. And you can see it's created at that moment to justify the Reformation. And if that anti-Catholicism of the Reformation is the thing that underpins that sense of difference, distinctness, separation. And unless we think, of course, this isn't the whole of it, but it's why there is, you see what I mean? There's this subliminal sense that it was so easy to invoke. So that's one idea that I want us to think about. I want us now to think about another one, another very, very contemporary problem, which is the problem of a multicultural society, and to look at the two contradictory faces of immigration in Britain. I don't want to talk about numbers at this point. I want to do something else. I want to talk about how we've dealt with it in both its good terms and bad terms. One of the things that's very striking about Britain, and I think it is wholly remarkable, is the way in which immigration, until very recently, was a very uncontroversial subject. Why? Why is it that has been historically much more controversial, for example, in virtually everywhere in continental Europe? The answer is to remember Britain is not a nation. The idea of Britain as a nation we're a paradox. We're a nation state that isn't a nation. And this goes, very useful to be doing this in Scotland. It goes back to 1707. Because, of course, in 1707, two completely separate monarchies that happened to share a common head negotiate with each other about some form of more intense union. And it's really fundamental that we understand what happened. The conventional, or what has become the conventional leftish or Scots independence account, is a form of colonization or suppression. Nothing can be further from the truth. The initiative was a double one. The English want two things. They want to close their back door against the threat of France and the threat of Catholicism, both of which could come through Scotland. The fundamental engagement of Britain at that point is that absolute central engagement of empire against France. Because remember, in that struggle for world empire with France, which dominates the great age of empire, which is not the 19th century, it's the 18th. The culminating war of empire is the 7 Years' War, 56 to 63. As Churchill says, the First World War, the war that determines that the world speaks English, because France loses India and it loses Canada. That's the absolute key war. And in that struggle, which I'll briefly talk about when we shift on to empire, England saw itself as Rome and it saw France as Carthage. It really is as simple as that. So England wants protection to close its back door against the threat of the Scots alliance, which of course had been a regular feature of Anglo-Scottish relations going right back to the reign of Edward I and the failed attempt at the conquest of Scotland. It wants to close the back door to the risk of Scotland allying with France, and also a Scotland allying with France and reintroducing Catholicism. But remember, Scotland itself is profoundly divided with the Scottish Highlands and the radically Protestant lowlands. And the radically Protestant lowlands are just as keen at doing down Catholics as the English are. That's one of the grounds of agreement between the two countries. The other is the Scots' passionate determination to be every bit as filthy imperialists as the English were, and their bitter jealousy of the success of the English empire, and heightened by the failure of their own attempt at empire, the Darien scheme, which would reduce Scotland to effective bankruptcy. So you get that extraordinary agreement between England and Scotland, in which Scotland surrenders the independence of the monarchy. You stop, when in fact the last time that there had been a separate Scottish coronation was actually Charles II during the Revolution. But you completely abandon the title of King of Scots. You instead have His Britannic Majesty, the King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Scotland. The King of the United Kingdom, in brackets of England and Scotland, but you don't use that. And you have a higher proportion of Scottish MPs in the English Parliament. You dissolve the Scottish Parliament, but you give Scotland deliberate over-representation in the English Parliament, a kind of early version of the Barnett formula. Remember, they've got statisticians who are now completely capable in the early 18th century of working out, more than they appear to be doing now, working out pretty accurate GDP figures and figures per head of population. So they do the calculations. They give Scotland deliberate over-representation. But remember, Scotland preserves every other lineament of separate national identity. We all know this, don't we? You preserve a Scottish church. The monarch actually changes religion as they go over the border. The king ceases to be an Anglican and he becomes a Presbyterian. A fact that was exploited, for example, by the marriage of Princess Anne. Her second marriage was illegal in the Church of England. It couldn't take place in the Church of England. It could take place in the Church of Scotland. So Princess Anne and Commander Lawrence, as he then was, scuttle across the border and get themselves safely married. Scotland preserves its entirely separate system of education. I'm in one of them now. There's a lovely story told of that when Margaret Thatcher wanted to make an example of the incompetence of the university system. This is back in the 1980s. She picked on the University of Aberdeen, which was going through an extremely bad patch, and there were serious proposals to close it. My dear friend Conrad Russell, Earl Russell, the youngest son of Bertrand Russell, rose in the House of Lords and gave one of the funniest short speeches there ever. And he's a relatively diffident manner at this kind of thing. Of course, you're not allowed to name the other house or whatever. So he wished for it to be conveyed to the right honourable lady in the other house. He understood that she may have been right, she may have been wrong, to wish to close down the University of Aberdeen. But could she please remember that in order to do so, she would first have to repeal the Act of Union, which went down wonderfully. Everybody cheered and laughed. But it was absolutely true. You have not only a separate church, a separate university system, you've a completely separate legal system. You've got a separate system of heraldry. You've got a separate royal court. You separate great offices of state. All of that. In other words, right from the beginning, England and Scotland had a separate identity. The idea of Britain was essentially for export. You are English or Scots at home. There is hardly any attempt at creating a single British consciousness. Yes, I know all about Britons, never shall be slaves. Nobody really called themselves a Briton, apart from a handful of people in Scotland. There was a North British hotel. If those of you who are familiar with the works of Oscar Wilde may remember the addresses. I remember them vividly because I actually played John Worthington in The Importance of Being Earnest. And John Worthington, as you will remember, when interrogated by Lady Bracknell, comes up with 3 addresses, and the wonderful response of Lady Bracknell, 3 addresses, that inspires confidence even in tradesmen. And there was one in Belgrave Square, the wrong side. There was one in somewhere or another in the home counties, and there was the idea, the absolute deal maker. There was the Sporran Faithshire North Britain. That's that. In other words, Scotland as at that point being treated as the north of this united entity. But they were mere linguistic tricks. The first football internationals are between England and Scotland. And above all, this is the key thing, there is no attempt at creating a single national system of education. Unlike every other European country. Every other European country is a creation of post-French Revolutionary unification with the use of compulsory state education to create a single national consciousness, a single form of the language, with usually much more extreme variations in the original language than there was within England. So in other words, and again, if we add Wales and Ireland, with Ireland obviously being, it becomes a very debatable, very terrible case, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. But as well as that, and these separate entities are not only exist, they're positively embraced by the monarchy. From the early 18th century, every one of the children of the Hanoverian kings, all the princes, and dozens of them, they're given an English title, a Scottish title, and then a Welsh title and an Irish title. You have separate orders of chivalry. You have the Thistle in Scotland, you have the Patrick in Ireland, you've got the Garter in Wales. You have separate royal bodyguards. You've got the archers in Scotland, you've got the yeomen of the guard, and the gentlemen pensioners in England. There was one in Ireland. So what do you see what I mean? This is why I think we were able to accommodate immigration
so easily. We hadn't had that attempt that you see so clearly in France, or of course in America until the 1960s, where you were compelled to change your name. You had to, in a sense, surrender much of your background to become American. We never did that. So we were always used, if you like, from the beginning, we were multinational. And in the late 19th, early 20th century, this becomes completely explicit. You actually turn Edinburgh back into a capital. You restore for the first, you actually make, it's built earlier, you make Holyrood habitable. That happens under George V. You create Cardiff as the most magnificent set of civic buildings in England, with the influence of Lloyd George at the beginning of the in the Edwardian period. And of course, following the partition of Ireland, you invent Belfast. So it's this extraordinarily complex thing. But there is one point, and this is the central one. Despite this, as it were, unity in multiplicity, which is how I would describe it, there was a single dominant political culture. And it's very important we understand Wales, Scotland, if you like, the Celtic fringe, were essentially cultural. So it's Burns, it's kilts, it's, Burns suppers, it's bagpipes, God help us, and the same sort of thing in Wales. England famously doesn't have a national dress. As H.G. Wells said, the great pride of England is we don't have one. Actually, you do. It's Savile Row, but that's a completely different matter. We taught the world how to dress, but we taught the world how to do most things. But there was, what linked all those separate political cultures together was one thing: the recognition of the primacy of the Anglo-British political tradition. And the catastrophe that's happened is that we have not, as it were, made that a condition of assimilation for our immigrant population. There's no reason whatever why they don't keep their separate religious traditions. I've talked passionately about my friendship with Rabbi Hugo Grimm, who was a Jew at home. He was a prince of Israel at home. He invited myself and my late partner, I'm gay, actually to Passover. I've never experienced anything like it. A man who was a public figure, straightforward, leftish intellectual, absolute ideal fodder for the BBC, unlike me. At home, the absolute Jewishness. Somebody, like one of the great Rothschilds, Sir Jacob Rothschild, famous, this man, this mover, this shaker, who shapes every national museum, who invents Neil MacGregor, turns him from a mere editor of an obscure art journal into the kind of guru of art, suddenly would switch and say, I've got to remember occasionally to be king of the Jews. This is what I call, so in other words, what we need to go to is not multiculturalism, but biculturalism. That recognition of a single strand, which is essentially political, the architectonic quality of the English political structure, which is the one that goes back to Magna Carta, which is the one that goes back to the great English conservative tradition, which creates common law, the security of property, the liberty of the person, all the preconditions for the extraordinary economic, scientific, and cultural development of Britain after Union, and at that extraordinary turning point. Remember, between the Glorious Revolution of 1689 and Union in 1707, Britain turns from a mere satellite of France into the premier power of Europe. France has never, ever recovered from Blenheim. Do we all know where Blenheim is fought? It's just outside Munich. How does an English coalition defeat the French outside Munich? Can you think of what that means in terms of logistics, in terms of financial power? And remember, England is a quarter the size of France and has a fifth of the population. So how do you do it? You do it because you've revolutionized your economy, you've revolutionized your currency, you've revolutionized finance, you've revolutionized the whole apparatus of war. England, this Anglo-Scottish British state invents modernity in this astonishing small period. Our union is something that I would argue actually creates the world, but it does it through this extraordinary biculturalism. There's a miraculous fusion in difference. It's precisely because we are so individualistic, so different, that there has been this astonishing record of national success. So very briefly, let me just, and I'll cut short the business on empire, because I don't want to talk too long, and I do want to leave some time for the 70s. If we're to look at that empire that results from what I've just been talking about now, I think we've got to realise, and it's not, again, something terribly difficult. In other words, like what I was saying on our problems of modern multiculturalism and our great successes with it. What we need to do, we need to look at the model that was offered by the actual putting together of the Kingdom of Great Britain. And remember, the central core of union was not national identity. It was loyalty to the monarch. The monarch was why the monarchy was of such absolutely central importance, and why the retreat of the crown from politics, and in my view, the mistake that the late Queen made after of ignoring her role as final manager of the political system after the crisis of the succession to Macmillan to King Charles's coronation, which deliberately removes Parliament from the coronation for the first time since 1689 and removes the word politics actually from the coronation completely. So if you actually looked at Charles's coronation, you'd imagine that he was the absolute monarch of a theocratic monarchy. You'd also imagine that he were ruled by love. This was politics according to John Lennon. And in complete contempt of the central political role of the monarchy in the whole of that extraordinary 3 centuries of Anglo-British history. But if we're to understand that extraordinary empire, there is only a single analogy will do, and it is Rome. England saw itself as Rome. Right back into the Tudor period, there was, as it were, it's both a myth and it's a reality. There is the conscious realization of the extraordinary similarities between the political structure of England and Republican early imperial Rome, with Parliament being seen as a Senate and extraordinary sense of self-identification. If you look in the great squares of London, you will see the great landlords of the 18th century, all of them draped in togas. They never appear in their own dress. And in the same way that Rome is the great empire of the Mediterranean, Britain was, of course, the empire of the world, the actual creator of the world economy. Globalism is simply an ugly modern ism that really derives from the British Empire. The first time you actually see the world as both an economic unit and also as a single, really as a single, what's the word I want, strategic question to be conceived of and to be understood as a unity. And in exactly the same way, I think that Rome dissolves into its empire in the 4th and 5th centuries. And we are seeing something like that happening now. So what will happen, what will survive, is an idea of Britain, or I think more particularly, an idea of England, in exactly the same way that the idea of Rome remains to now, remains central to our cultural understanding. I think in the same way, the idea of England will remain long, I think, after England's identity has vanished, because what we've also got to understand about the present situation we find ourselves in is that the great changes, which I'll move on to now, of the 1990s and early 2000s, were deliberately designed to suppress the idea of England. Seems to me to be absolute and manifestly true. So England then, as the most contentious element of that multinational state that I was talking about now, because if you think about it for a second, it's much easier for a continental style cultural nationalism like Scotland or Wales or Ireland to survive the loss of empire than for the central imperial power, whose, if you actually look at that nature of English identity in that old multinational structure that I was talking about, it was top nation. It was the nation which made the most, that had the best system of law, that had invented Parliament and all the rest of it. And the clue to just how shattering the 20th century was to all of that is contained in that wonderful book, 1066 and all that, which ends, and has everybody read Sellers and Yeatman, 1066 and all that? It's one of the funniest books. It's a parody of history and parody of the teaching of history. But the last sentence, essentially at prep school level, but the last sentence of it is remarkable. It describes the defeat of Germany in the First World War and the emergence of America as the most powerful country in the world. And the last sentence is, we were talking about Fukuyama, the last and the end of history. The last sentence is as follows: and Britain ceased to be top nation and history came to a full stop. And that extraordinary sense of England, which identified itself with empire so completely. Well, finally, then I tease you with the idea that we're going back to the 1970s. What happened in 1974 is two things: the shattering defeat of the Conservative government of Edward Heath, and a Conservative government which had begun reasserting the importance of free market economics, so-called salesman, the salesman policy, and had finished up with vast inflation of the currency, thanks to the Barber boom. Barber, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, makes Liz Truss look like a model of economic probity. Property prices, the year that I moved to London in 72, 73, in London, property prices multiply 3 times. We had 25% inflation, right? Yeah? All of that. And the government fell. We tried price and incomes policies, 3-day weeks, and the whole lot. And the Labour government of Harold Wilson was elected. One person, and everything went even worse, exactly as I would predict is going to happen now. One person recognised what had happened, and it's Keith Joseph. And Keith Joseph writes, in retrospect, a year later, in April 1975, I thought I'd been a Conservative. I've been a member of a Conservative government, but the Conservative government hadn't governed with Conservatives, and I wasn't a Conservative either. And at that point, you get a conscious rediscovery of the works of classical economics, Adam Smith and his 20th century form in the works of Friedrich Hayek, and the realization that this is the way forward, and the emergence in 75 as Thatcher, as leader, committed to a program of radical change. And by the time that there is the, first of all, remember, there is what, again, I think we will experience, there is the summoning in of the IMF, an International Monetary Fund, in 1976, as Britain goes broke. And if anybody looking at the bond market at the moment, you will see we are a whisker away from doing the same thing. So I predict in 2026, the IMF will be in, and in 2029, there will be a Labour defeat on a scale that makes what's happened to the Tories now look modest. And what we've got to hope, in my view, is that there will be exactly a manifesto like the Conservative Manifesto of 1979. Can I suggest, whatever your political views are, you read it. It is a completely astonishing document that offers a precise analysis of what has happened and sets out an absolute, unlike the guff that we've seen about change from Starmer, that sets out an exact and precise forecast of what they're going to do, which they do, to tackle inflation, to tackle trade union power, to tackle the entire structure of decline. It's quite astonishing. A series of absolutely specific commitments which are followed through with, obviously, some terrible consequences as well as some very good ones. So what I think we've got to realise is we're in exactly analogous position, except the solution is not free market economics. What happened was, what had happened and what Keith Joseph describes brilliantly is that from 1945 onwards, you had a Conservative Party that accepted the changes brought about by Attlee and simply saw its job as to try to mitigate their worst features. So the economic crisis of Keynesianism and inflationism and hyper trade union power got worse and worse and worse until there was that great reversal. What I want to argue is the catastrophe, the reason that our government has completely stopped working. I mean, have you written, this government can't do anything. There's no accident that Downing Street has simply frozen up like a jammed engine. And the reason is exactly what happened from 1977 to 2010. You did 3 or 4 main things. The consequences of all of them was you actually removed power from the government. You transferred power from the politician into everybody else, into the lawyer, into the technocrat, into the quangocracy, into a multitude of different committees. Look quickly at what you do. And the first thing you do is you give independence to the Bank of England. That means the most important single decisions about the management of the currency. The thing, by the way, that if we go back to we were talking about the great glories of Britain at that moment of union, the very end of the 17th, the beginning of the 18th century, the government regarded the quality of the currency as being so important. Who do you appoint as Master of the Mint? You appoint Isaac Newton. You appoint the most brilliant mathematician of the day as the Master of the Mint. We instead, I'm afraid, have got Andrew Bailey, and that is the measure of the absolute collapse. And you look at the staggering level of monetary mismanagement. The fact that when interest rates are virtually zero, you sell the national debt with an inflation guarantee. It can only go in one direction, against you. And in other words, you create a series of structures which guarantee mismanagement. As we saw from COVID, having a single issue committee guarantees it will do stupid things, because politics is about balance. If you create a single issue committee, things are bound to go wrong. And we created this series of quangos, the Climate Change Committee, the English Nature, all of which focus on a single issue against everything else. And then you back them up by the creation of a Supreme Court, which regards itself basically as being superior to Parliament. Then you produce idiotic things like the Equality Act, because you invert the meaning of words. The Equality Act is all about inequality. The Equality Act also incorporates, would you believe it or not, the Marxist theory of the labour theory of value. It actually has got a series of equations which tell judges to set wages. This is why we bankrupted Birmingham. The extraordinary notion that judges can determine the relative wages of women who are cleaners and men who are dustmen. And it's deranged. I mean, absolutely, it's a preposterous theory of economics that has been legislated into law. Similarly, we've legislated the target of 2050 for net zero into law. So you have judges determining fuel policy. It's demented. This is why nothing works. You've got, of course, the right of judges to intervene over detailed planning matters. Why have we had the problems that we've done with HS2? Because you've created this extraordinary system in which everything blocks. And the worst of all, of course, is the incorporation of the human rights, of the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, human rights, like equality, they sound wonderful and cuddly and lovely, but by definition, if there are universal human rights, the state doesn't matter. There is a higher source of law. That means that what has been the fundamental principle of British law, which is you're bound by it because you participated in the making of it, is thrown away. This means something, the famous motto of Roman law, salus populi suprema lex, the safety of the people is the supreme law, is thrown away because the people no longer exist. If you have a notion of universal human rights, frontiers shouldn't exist. We're all the same. There is no cultural difference. So the whole mess that we're in now is a creation of an extraordinary, unthought through, chaotic application of abstract principle to what was a constitution derived from profound, serious historical rootedness and political practice. It cannot work. The Labour Party itself has become the party of the nomenclatura. We now have all of these things that I've been talking about, the civil service, the public sector in general, lawyers, particularly human rights lawyers, the entire structure of the quangos. It's become the exact equivalent of the nomenclatura in the Soviet Union, a privileged class. Why have they suddenly all been showered with huge pay increases? Why do they have pensions much higher than everybody else? Why do they have civil servants retire at 60? It's completely extraordinary. It's a privileged class, of which the supreme example is Starmer. So it is perfectly certain this government of the nomenclatura cannot redeem itself any more than the government of the late 1970s. The only question will be whether there is somebody or some people within the Conservative Party that can do that same sort of radical rethinking exercise which Keith Joseph did, and to produce a leader like Thatcher. It will not be perfect. There will be people who lose. But unfortunately, human beings are not perfect, and there are no perfect solutions to problems, and any good Conservative knows you've got to live with imperfection, and the disaster, the supreme lesson of history, is to pursue perfection leads to tyranny. It's as simple as that. Thank you. I'm very sorry, I went on too long. I got carried away. There we are.